Good evening from Los Angeles. I'm Anjali Sharan, Associate Director of Asia Society, Southern California. Welcome to tonight's program, Making India Great Amid the U.S.-China Rivalry. We're hosting this program in partnership with Asia Society Policy Institute. And I have my colleague from ASPI, Anubhav Gupta here, who will be moderating the discussion. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. My thanks to Asia Society Southern California for hosting this virtual discussion. I'm really delighted to be with all of you for what should be a really fascinating conversation on India's rise and the challenges and opportunities that India will face in 2021 and beyond. We have two phenomenal experts with us today who not only have a finger on the pulse of what's happening in India at this minute, but have thought long and hard about where India sits within the global context and what it needs to do in the medium to long term to become a global power. Dhruva Jaishankar is the director of the U.S. Initiative at the New Delhi-based Observer Research Foundation. He is also a non-resident fellow with the U.S Institute in Australia and writes a monthly column for the Hindustan Times. Dhruva was previously a fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies Department at Brookings India in New Delhi and with Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Prior to that, he was a transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. And a personal plug, his Twitter feed is excellent, and so I recommend that you follow him there. Aparna Pande is a research fellow and the director of Hudson Institute's Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia. Aparna's research interest is South Asia with a special focus on India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and their particular focus on their security and foreign policies. She has authored multiple books on these subjects, including Explaining Pakistan's Foreign Policy, Escaping India, From Chanakya to Modi, Evolution of India's Foreign Policy, and most recently this year, he published Making India Great, the Promise of a Reluctant Global Power. Dhruva and Aparna, welcome to this event, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anubhav. Pleasure.
Thank you. Great. Quick ground rules. So for our folks, all our attendees that are joining us on Zoom, if you have any questions for our experts, feel free to type those in and post them in the Q&A box. And in the midst of our conversation, I'll get to as many of those as I can. So let's jump right in. Aparna, again, congrats on the book. And I want to ask you about the title. I think for a lot of the people in the States, the title, Making India Great, evokes a certain soon-to-be outgoing American president. So I wanted to ask you, obviously, that was not, I know that was not the intention, and that's not what you're referring to when you were saying Make India Great. So give us a sense of your choice there and what you mean.
Thank you so much, Anubhav. I'd like to start by thanking Asia Society, Southern California, Anjali and her team, and ASPI, Anubhav. And of course, it's a pleasure to be with Dhruv on the panel. India will be the world's most populous country in a few years, till recently actually scheduled to become the world's third largest economy. It has the fourth largest military, and it is the world's largest democracy. So there's always been this belief that India will rise, and there's been the promise of India, 5,000-year-old culture, large and youthful population, potential for economy and a large military, and its ability to build and maintain a democratic political system. This has made India a natural partner, and there has been a sort of a conversation for decades about a rising India and an emerging India, and a to-be great power India. However, as much as Indians and India's leaders want India to be great, and want India to be a global power, I believe there's also a hesitance in building and exercising hard power. It's almost as if the country would like to be a great power simply because it's right to be one. So what my book looks at primarily is the dichotomy that lies at the heart, which is the belief in being a great or global power, but the reluctance to implement policies and take actions that would help achieve those goals. For example, in the social arena, economic, human capital, military, foreign policy, or grand strategy. And before I end, I'll just mention that, the COVID pandemic has actually brought forth a lot of these challenges. So you look at the societal frictions, the challenges to India's democratic polity, India's human capital frailties, from healthcare to education, underinvestment in military preparedness, and finally, the rise of China and its impact on India's foreign policy and grand strategy. Thank you.
Let me ask you about that, really a follow-up question. So, a lot of foreign policy commentators and India watchers have said they agree with you, especially on foreign policy. They've said that India has been, as you say, reluctant or hesitant. But there's also been, I think, conventional wisdom is that the current government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, plenty of analysts think that India has adopted a much more proactive, much more robust foreign policy. So my question to you is, one, do you agree with that kind of mainstream assessment? And two, even if you do, what are some ways that reluctance, especially when it comes to foreign policy, still plays a role under the current government?
I would agree. India's foreign policy is more proactive in the last 6 years. Definitely, the Prime Minister has brought a passion to foreign policy, which was lacking for a few decades now. Where I would say I still I'm waiting for more is I sometimes use an example which I've used in my book, which is, and it's taken from Alice in Wonderland. In a certain part of the book, Alice meets the cat and he asks the cat, where should I go? So the cat says, where do you want to go? He says, I don't know. The cat says, it doesn't matter where you go. So my question at the end of the day for the Indian policymaker is that, India has always believed that a multipolar world is better for India. There should be many poles and then India can play a role. Secondly, India has always been more comfortable with not just US and China, but there being other countries like Russia, Soviet, Europe, Japan. The problem India faces with the rise of China is that it is not just a country which is rising, it is a country which lays claim to Indian territory, which borders India. So a superpower rivalry of the Cold War was easier for India to get along, to tackle, because the superpowers were at some distance and did not covet Indian territory, and by and large accepted India's sphere of influence. China does not do any of these. My short answer to your question about how India's policy towards China is framing, yes. I see the policy towards China, however, being by and large the same. There's a hedging, there's a managing, and there's a belief, at least till recently, that high-level policy summits, whether it's Wuhan or Mamallapuram, will somehow convince the Chinese state that economic relations with India mean you should not push India too far. And I don't think that is how the Chinese Communist Party and state under Xi Jinping will function. So I think India may need to have a more nuanced or may need to do more than it's doing up till now. I'll stop there.
Well, we'll get to China in a little bit. Dhruv, let me bring you in on that big picture question about India's desire to be a great power and what Aparna has mentioned is its kind of reluctance to exercise and do the things necessary to get there. If you look forward, say 10 years, 2030, given a path that India would want to take, what would you want to see India do? What would you want to see it change in order to be in a better position 10 years from now to be considered, right, say, close to great power?
So, I'm not sure. I would necessarily agree with the notion that India's rise has been reluctant. In fact, I think I would agree with the empirical analysis of that Aparna lays out, which is there have been many obstacles to India's rise, and there continue to be many severe obstacles to India's rise. I think there's no doubt about that. But I'm not sure if it is always a lack of will on India's part. And I think if you look back over the last 70 years since India's independence, you had a country that came out of 2 centuries of colonialism. It was very fractured, very diverse, completely impoverished. And yet managed to construct a functioning democracy in that environment, certainly in a robust electoral democracy. It managed to at least initially increase standards of living, perform massive agricultural reforms, massive public health initiatives. Again, despite severe headwinds at the time, particularly in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when it was very dependent on food aid. In the 70s and 80s, it actually, developed a nuclear weapons program. Again, despite international sanctions. It tested those nuclear weapons in 1998. But you also see it sort of intervening in its neighborhood in the early 1970s, including the creation of Bangladesh. So this doesn't, I mean, sound like a reluctant power if you, I think, take this full arc. Since the 1990s, of course, I think you've seen a much more attractive economic picture developing, at least for India. Which of course now is facing headwinds and has really been since 2011, since the a few years after the global financial crisis. So I think, again, if you look at this arc, it's often, I think there are a number of problems. These include a lack of coordination in government, administrative capacity, fiscal constraints, some very real challenges with managing a democratic polity. Lack of human labor productivity and adequate skills and knowledge and research and technology. So I think these are all the very real challenges that India faces today and continues to face. And the coronavirus pandemic, I think, has added another bump in the road. But looking forward, I think the question then remains sort of how will India rebound from this? So I think earlier we were looking at something like almost 10% economic contraction for the year. The latest quarterly figure suggests it might be slightly better than that. So we'd still see a contraction, but not perhaps as severe as had been feared earlier. The question I think that remains is sort of how India bounces back from this. And until now, this is an economy that has been driven by services and by consumption. Can this be an opportune moment for India to put in places an industrial policy that will actually increase, bring people into the middle class, in some ways replicate what we have seen in other parts of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. I think the jury's still out on that. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion by any means. But I think that would be something to look for over the next year or two.
Great. Well, we like there to be distinction and difference. So I'm glad that you guys don't completely agree on something. We'll get to some of that in a bit. But that's a nice segue to COVID-19, Dhruva. So, this brings us to the current predicament where we're facing a staggering economic crisis and a public health calamity that continues to get worse by the day. As you mentioned, India now has the second most cases, confirmed cases in the world. It's approaching 10 million. We now have tragically over 137,000 Indians that have lost their lives because of this. And so, Aparna, let me ask you, India, if you compare it to some of the other major countries in the world, per capita numbers, it's a little bit different. But if you look at absolute numbers, India is, at the bottom in terms of how it's performed. So, Aparna, give us a sense of why that is. And, what has this experience revealed to you about India's institutional capacities and weaknesses? You hinted at this in your opening answer, but delve a little bit more deeply into why we're seeing what's happening in India.
Sure. 3 quick points. One, India has underinvested in human capital. It's also underinvested in institutions, and as part of human capital underinvestment, healthcare and education, especially healthcare. India did not follow the path of the East Asian or Southeast Asian or North Asian economies who invested in primary healthcare and primary education. India did not go down that path. So India has, so they are the sort of the dichotomies, right? India has a number of doctors, medical institutes, they are well known all over the world, but India is unable to provide primary healthcare to most of its citizens. Even though there are government clinics, they still don't provide for everybody. And India has not really spent that much of resources. If you look at per GDP, India spends about, sort of around 2% or 3% in a good year on social indicators like healthcare. And so there's one is the problem of the past, the legacy of the past, that you have not really invested in it. 2 is the fact that it's not that you can't do it if you don't plan. And here the example I love to use the most is that of the Kumbh Mela. Every 6 years, in different cities across North India, you have this large gathering of about millions of people attending in one city. Indian states build entire cities. They provide law and order, healthcare, every possible thing that those will require, their transportation, infrastructure. So India can do it when it's when it's, like a sort of plan and prepare so as to provide it to everybody at everything. And the third part is resources, which is that, at the end of the day, you do need to allocate resources consistently for about a decade or more if you want to build human capital, whether it is, education, whether it is healthcare, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is female labor force participation. India has sort of done it off and on. It's never been a consistent policy. And so that's the result. That's what we see today. When the COVID pandemic hit, that we don't really have the healthcare infrastructure which can actually take care of millions of Indians.
Dhruva, let me turn to you on that. As Aparna has pointed out, there are a lot of institutional weaknesses that you can't solve, in one go. So the government kind of inherits a lot of the state incapacity. Given that as the context, how would you rate the government's performance overall to the COVID crisis? And is this something, India was in some ways, I remember when the lockdown was first announced, the U.S. experience was there was not enough action potentially in the there was a lot of criticism of the government for not acting quickly enough. It seemed at the beginning that the Indian government actually acted quite quickly and was taking the crisis very seriously given the severity of the lockdown. So how would you rate the government's performance?
So, I mean, I think mixed, there's a glass half full and a glass half empty way of looking at it. So, India was one of the first countries to impose international travel restrictions in January and February of this year, when at the time a lot of countries didn't think that the coronavirus would spread much beyond China and a few other countries. You saw a very severe national lockdown put in place, which basically ground the economy to a halt for a month or two. So you're right that these early steps were taken, but clearly they were not effective enough in terms of stemming the tide completely, and we've seen a large number of cases proliferate. One of the things I think to note is that it has really varied significantly from state to state. And like a lot of things in India, whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about social welfare, on whether we're talking about infrastructure, almost anything, there's immense variation in India from state to state, from city to city. And so the majority of cases are really restricted to about 7-8 states that have where and particularly initially urban centers, and then it's moved to more rural centers. But a state like Kerala, for example, did perform relatively well, even though they've had a larger number of cases. They've had relatively few deaths. They've been very good at managing that. In other cases, it's been more difficult and more problematic. So I think the lesson for me is in some ways this is a federal federal structure, much like the United States, and I think there's been an immense variation, and the best thing actually is to learn from which states have done best and try and replicate those efforts in other states.
Great. So let's talk about the economic crisis, and Dhruva, you kind of mentioned this a little bit. So the economy, we learned this past week that the economy shrunk by 7.5% in the previous quarter from July through September. And this is the first time, according to some reports, that India had 2 consecutive quarters of the economy shrinking. So there's been reporting that this is potentially India's first official recession. I've had, and as you mentioned, there are some people who think that coming quarters will see improvement. Other economists, including Pranav Sen, has said that this quarter, the current quarter we're in, is likely to be worse than the previous one, and that he also thinks that the first quarter of 2021 that India might shrink by a little bit even in that quarter. So we're not really even to the point where we can talk about a recovery. We're still kind of in the downward trajectory. So I want to raise a question to both of you, but let's start with Aparna. Aparna, given we're talking about India's rise and where it wants to get, how much of an inflection point is this? How much does this handicap India, this economic downturn, in the medium to long term?
If India is able to get out of this recession, let's say by next year, I mean, as of now, World Bank and IMF are saying by 2021, 2022, India will be back to 6%. Then it will not make that much of a difference medium to long term. If, however, this continues, because we must remember that even before COVID, India's economic growth had slowed down. It was down to about 2.5% according to many economists. The government figures were around 4%. So India's economy has slowed down over the last few years. So it was a slowed down economy which was hit by COVID. If the economy recovers and goes back to 6%, then everything will be fine. If, however, it does not, then it has impacts on three areas, I would say, especially one, the less money you have, the less money you can spend on issues, on the areas that the international community is interested in, which will be military and foreign policy. It will also be the development assistance you can provide, because most of the money you will have will need to be focused on welfare programs, need to be also focused on subsidies, on actually pulling the people who are falling below poverty. So domestic concerns will be the first. Second will be that India's attraction, part of India's attraction, or a large part of it to the global community has been that India has a very large middle class, India has a very large consumer base, India has a very large labor pool. And so companies want to move to India, or India would like to attract them. If you are not growing at minimum 5-6% by next year or the year after, there's less of an incentive for companies to come here and more to go to Vietnam, Philippines, or other countries. So you're going to lose, so you will lose out on sort of the geo-strategic advantages which are coming. Part of the attraction and part of your deliverables, what you can deliver for the Indo-Pacific will come down, and you'll have problems at home. So we have to really see whether this is a technical recession for a quarter or two, or it's actually going to stretch beyond 21-22.
Great. Dhruva, same question, but with an additional add-on. We have a question from one of our attendees, Gunjan Bagla, who's saying that, our conversation has really been about policy so far, and what about India's great companies? That a lot of its greatness comes from its entrepreneurs, its big firms that are, internationally recognized and valued. Is there some route where the Indian private sector can, try to help get India out of this crisis? How big of a part of the recovery is the private sector?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, look, I think it's a challenging thing for every country. They're going to be facing a lot of obstacles going forward, in the United States as well. I think for India, the challenges are few-fold, and Aparna keeps coming back to this. I suspect this will be I agree completely with her, which is I think this will be a recurring theme. But human capital is going to be a big part of it. In some ways, the Indian story, if you look at what India gives to the world, it's actually 1.4 billion people. It's not a country that's rich in natural resources. It's not so if you can actually provide a sort of an education and livelihood to those 1.4 billion people in a sustainable manner, bringing them into a middle class, that will really be revolutionary. And we have, while we have seen improvements, significant improvements over the last 25 years, it's obviously not been as much as many would have hoped. The question on companies is an interesting one. I mean, I think this is a credit to Indian companies. There are many successful cases, including companies that have been very successful abroad in markets in North America, in Europe. I mean, just last year I was in a factory in a Mahindra factory in Texas, and there's an Indian company that is now one of the largest tractor producing companies in the United States, going up against very established markets dominated by companies like John Deere and others. So there is a really good story to be told there on the pharmaceutical side as well. But ultimately, the success of these companies is tied very closely to public policy. And I'll give you the example of the Indian software revolution. We take it for granted today that India is India has successful software companies, and in some ways they've been at the forefront of driving the Indian growth story over the last 3 decades or so. But it wasn't a complete accident. In some ways, it was a confluence of 3 factors that came together at this point in the late 1990s. One was actually the presence of a sizable number of trained English-speaking engineers that really were a product of the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, and other such engineering programs. The second was actually policy changes that took place, some of it at the state level, some of it at the national level, which gave, basically dropped import duties on critical goods, provided easy land acquisition for software companies, created basically an incentive structure through progressive policy means for companies like Infosys and TCS and others to set up and develop. And the third thing, of course, was the demand side, which is you had the Y2K crisis in 99, and suddenly there was this demand for solutions to that. And so those three things came together to really create, in some ways, the Indian services revolution. So I do think companies do play a very important role and will continue to play an important role, but ultimately it will also a good policy will determine have a great say in their futures.
And returning to good policy, so I have one last question kind of about the current crisis. So one thing that we discussed about how a lot of the things that are happening are really out of the government's control. But there are a few things that the government does have direct control over. One is a stimulus package, and two is policies to enact economic reform. Of those two things domestically, how would you rate the government's performance so far, Aparna? On the stimulus, for example, the IMF has estimated that India's stimulus so far adds up to about 2.5. Its fiscal measures add up to about 2.5% of GDP. In the US, the CARES Act alone is north of 10%. Brazil, which has the third most cases in the world, the IMF estimates that its fiscal measures add up to about 13 to 14%. So India is really far behind. Tell us about what that tells you about the government's response. Is 2.5, is the fiscal stimulus package so far enough? What else does India need to do?
So yes, India's stimulus package is less than many other countries, but sort of the way the Indian government looks at it is that it'll not just be the amount of money which you're getting through direct transfer. There's going to be, sort of the subsidies and the welfare schemes which come indirectly to its citizens. The problem which has happened is, I would say, three. One, there has been a decline in India's economic growth, as I mentioned, for the last few years, but even before COVID. So there's less money in your hands, there's less money that you can give to people. Two, is the fact that a large number of the people who actually need this money are people who are not in the system yet, right? I'm sure most of you remember the images of those migrant workers who are walking. They are not part of the system. They are not people whom you can actually provide a lot of this assistance to, whether through direct transfers or through indirect transfers. So the Indian part of the problem is that a lot of people are in the unorganized sector and may have smartphones, but may not necessarily be able to access all the benefits that you can actually give them. And the third part of stimulus packages. This is not something which is has been there for years. It is more provide make it easier for them to get access to diesel or petrol or food. It is not a question of providing stimulus packages. So I think it's a combination of factors where you have less money, where you have a large number of people outside the organized sector. And third, where you are not necessarily a government which sort of provides, it's been difficult in this country and many other countries. So looking at the fact that India actually shut down the entire country almost for about 3 to 6 months, providing stimulus packages is something which the Indian government is not that used to doing.
And Dhruva, on the issue of economic reforms, we've had some movement on the agriculture side, as well as labor reforms. Going back to what you talked about, that the government faces obstacles. Just last week, there were 250 million people, workers, farmers, who were opposed to these recent announcements. And so there is political domestic pushback. And so the government has taken some bold decisions. But there's been expectation in the international community, especially the international businesses, who had wanted a second kind of spate of big picture, big bold reforms on the energy sector, land, labor, and so on. So I'd like to ask you about, is this something the current Indian government prioritizes? Is that part of the agenda given this crisis, or is that kind of out of the political picture at the moment, those bigger reforms?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are three sort of different ways of looking at it, and I don't sort of necessarily ascribe to any one of them, but I'll just give you sort of three sort of ways of looking at it. One is that basically sort of big reforms are not really possible barring a crisis. We are in a crisis now, so now would be an opportunity to do some of that. But that's something that Arvind Subramaniam, who used to be chief economic advisor to the finance ministry, said. It's very hard to put through things barring a crisis. One could actually even make the case that even this crisis isn't actually bad enough. I mean, if you look at sort of the current account deficit, if you look at foreign exchange reserves and stuff like that, this doesn't look like 1991 for India, which was when the events that spurred a previous wave of major economic reforms. So I mean, I think that's one way of looking at this. So this is actually an opportune moment to push through a lot of things that were pending for some time. A second view, and this is something that a lot of proponents of the government would say, is that actually some of these things are being done, and that if you look at what's happened on a little bit on education, but pharma reform, reforms on certain sectors being liberalized now, including defense and insurance, amongst others, that there are a spate of reforms that are taking place, and sort of people should be paying more attention to that. So that's a sort of another view. A third is that some of these things are just politically too sensitive, and that whatever the government may or may not want to do, and that it's going to be hard going. And I think the farmer protests that we're seeing is a case in point. I mean, this is something that people who otherwise would applaud if as a sort of liberalizing a policy, and yet we're seeing large scale protests as emerging. So I think it depends on sort of which lens you want to look at these developments through. There's obviously sort of a glass half full and a glass half empty approach.
Well, so let's go back to kind of the central kind of disagreement that you guys had. We have a question from David Carl, and he asked, Dhruva, your point about India having faced heavy obstacles is totally fair, but other countries in Asia, China, especially China, have gone through a similar transformation in a much shorter period of time. You also have countries like Japan, the Asian tigers, who have essentially used an export-oriented model to try to really develop at a faster pace. And India's experience after the 1991 crisis seemed to suggest that was in some ways the path that India should take as well. But in recent years, we've seen under the Modi government, we've had the Make in India campaign and now the Self-Reliant India campaign, in which the government wants to access global value chains and wants to bolster the domestic manufacturing sector. And the government's been good about relaxing capital flows. So it's much easier now to invest in India. But it seems to have gone in the other direction when it comes to trade. And the Self-Reliant India campaign, I think, raised a lot of eyebrows internationally because people weren't quite sure what it meant. They wondered if this meant import substitution. They wondered if this meant more protectionism. And this came again at the backdrop of India coming out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which it had negotiated for quite some time. It came at the back of the government raising tariffs in a few different areas. So Aparna, my question to you is, given, what do we see going forward from India's trade outlook? And is the Self-Reliant India campaign, to you, what's kind of the substance behind the bumper sticker? What do you see this, to you, what does that mean in terms of India's outlook when it comes to international commerce, international trade, international investment?
Thanks, Anubhav. Actually, India has long sought self-sufficiency, right? So, I mean, it goes back to the 1950s, 1960s. It was self-sufficiency then. It was Make in India. It was Atmanirbhar Bharat. So in many ways, that there has been a consistency. India has long sought self-sufficiency in the economic arena. Part of it, has to deal with the legacy of colonial rule and the belief that if multinational corporations come into the market, then they will actually take over the market and wipe out domestic companies. And so India needs to protect them. But the problem is that India's desire for self-sufficiency has often bordered on protectionism. That is how I look at it. I mean, seeking to build your own brands, ensuring that your domestic companies are not wiped out by foreign competition is a noble goal. Preventing competition within the Indian market and using regulation to benefit indigenous companies, however, does not help you build a global economy. Because at the end of the day, what India is trying to do is to become part of the global economy. India wants to be part of the global supply chains. If the world is decoupling to some extent from China, India would like India to be part of that network and Indian companies to be part of it. So yes, I mean, on the one hand, so there's the dichotomy we see, right? So India needs foreign capital, India needs technology, India needs to be part of the global supply chain and the global trading network. On the other hand, India's instinctive urges are to be semi-protectionist and to ensure that Indian companies and the Indian market is in some ways protected from any of the vagaries which come with allowing foreign investment, foreign capital, foreign companies to come in. And I think it's that tug of war which still goes on, and it borders more on protectionism than actually opening up the Indian economy.
Dhruva, I'll ask you a comment kind of along the same lines, but I'd like to also start talking about U.S. India relations, and putting this into context. India isn't alone, right? When it comes to some of this rhetoric, we have America first in the United States. It was really Donald Trump that started a lot of these tariff wars around the world. We have now with the incoming Biden administration a Buy American plan that's going to be announced. And so it's not something that India is unique in, but India does seem to have this dilemma where some of the countries whose trajectory it wants to emulate, it doesn't seem to be following that trajectory in terms of policy very closely when it comes to really being export oriented. And if you disagree with that, please do.
Yeah, so a couple, a couple of thoughts on that. So one is sort of, as I think David Carl had a question on this, is why China faced similar headwinds, after 1949, the Chinese Revolution, just 2 years after Indian independence. Why were the trajectories so different? And I think really there are two reasons for that. Until about 1990, 1989, 1990, actually Indian per capita GDP was actually higher than China's, which is kind of remarkable to think about, which isn't that long ago, 30 years ago. Since then, the remarkable thing is sort of India has, the period after that saw the spurt in Indian growth. China's growth was basically 2 to 3 times faster than that over a sustained period. And which is why we see the disparity today, which is almost, the Chinese GDP is about 5 times almost India's today. What accounts for this? I'd say two broad things. One is, as Aparna rightly pointed out, China made much bigger investments early on in human capital, particularly education and healthcare. So even at a time when China's GDP per capita was below India's, its literacy rate was higher. Its women in the workforce was higher. Its public health indicators, longevity and such were greater. So that was clearly one, and I think that is something where India is belatedly now trying to sort of catch up on and improve, uplift those factors. The second thing, I think, there is a sort of democratic change factor at play as well, which is a little bit like a light switch. As soon as Deng Xiaoping, unleashed a set of reforms, you started seeing it filtering down to the provincial level, to in China in the 1980s itself. And it took again a good decade for it to really manifest itself in many ways. But in India, it's obviously not as simple as that. Even if any government wants to do something, it really is much more tricky. It's politically much more difficult. So a combination of these factors, I think, has to be taken into account. Now, there are other things around the margins. I think over time, China has improved its administrative capability, but that's something that actually came later as it grew. So I do think we have to look at that, because when you put India in a comparison to China over the last 3 decades, it's obviously a very unfavorable. But I think in the absence of China, at least until 2011, and I think fits and starts after that, India's rise would be seen as quite remarkable in any other context. Which leads to a second related question on trade and trade openness. So I think, again, contrary to popular narratives, India is actually much more open than a lot of other economies. So its trade to GDP ratios, just as of last year, was 40%, which is higher, to put it in perspective, higher than China's, higher than Japan's, higher than the United States, higher than Brazil's. A lot of that is is Indian imports. So India has the third largest current account deficit of any country after the United States and UK. But this idea that India is sort of not open is restricted to certain sectors. I think agriculture is one. Surprisingly, services is another. It's impossible for foreign lawyers to work in India. But many other sectors are surprisingly open, including goods trade. So just to give you an example, India is the third largest energy importer, it has second largest number of foreign students of any country. It is the second largest defense importer of any country. So again, I think the question of Indian openness needs to be put into a little bit of context, which leads to the decision on trade negotiations, particularly RCEP, which has been the subject of considerable discussion. India has had a major trade deficit with China, at times running up to $60 billion, which is more than its entire defense budget. This, despite not having a preferential trade agreement with the PRC. There was a strong feeling that India entering into RCEP with China and other countries in Asia would actually exacerbate that. And that Indian concerns, including those related to rules of origin, were not being sufficiently taken into account by the negotiating parties. So for this reason, I think that this is what led to the decision last year to withdraw from RCEP. It was signed. India already has preferential trading agreements with ASEAN, Japan, and South Korea. Looking forward, I don't know which way it's going to go. There is clearly a protectionist instinct and protectionist rhetoric coming from many circles in India. There's also a strong view that India needs to decouple from China for political reasons and security reasons. And at this point of time, a combination of those two factors are at play for, to explain that sort of explains a lot of current policy. The question, I think, going forward will be which of those two wins out more over the end. And I think Aparna alluded to this as well, which is, will we see the more protectionist viewpoint win out? Or, I mean, this is what I personally would hope, is will we see an India that is open, but actually works better with complementary economies and complementary partners around the world, including the United States. So I think that is really, I think, the part of the choices facing India collectively going forward.
Great. Well, let's move on to the U.S. India relationship so we can start kind of looking about what's coming up. Aparna, as a lot of folks, surprisingly, the U.S. India relationship fared quite well in some ways under President Trump. You had very visible kind of symbols of that in the Howdy Modi rally in Houston. But in addition to that, defense and strategic ties grew, and generally speaking, despite President Trump's kind of harangue of India on tariffs, generally speaking, the relationship kind of moved forward and advanced. And so I wanted to ask you, under a Biden administration, how do you see the relationship going forward? Do you see this as continuing from the trajectory we were already on? Do you see the relationship taking a step back? Or do you think there is a kind of an extra step, an extra level of the relationship to be taken to?
I mean, there's always an extra step when it comes to India and other countries' relationship, because there's a sort of, the potential is always for more. There's a lot more that the two countries can do. So I'd say, President-elect Biden, many years ago in 2006, I believe he said that by 2020, India-US should be the main partnership or the critical partnership. So he's somebody who's championed India-US ties over the decades as senator, as vice president. So I do believe India will be important because it's a relationship he cares about. Second, sort of the Asia Pacific and now the Indo-Pacific is something which the Democrats are also on board with. It's not just a Republican policy or strategy. And so I believe that will remain important. And if Indo-Pacific is important and the US-China peer competition or peer rivalry continues, India will be a critical country for strategic reasons as well as for economic reasons. But the third part, I would say is, this sort of, there will be a sort of, the India-US relationship has these pegs, right, as the economic dimension. So the tariff and that issue is old. It will continue, but there could be some positives. There's a possibility that under the Biden administration, India could actually get back the GSP, which was taken away under the Trump administration. So that would actually benefit India at a time when India's economy needs some additional support. Second, in the sense of the defense trade, the military cooperation, that will also come to the strategic partnership. there are people who worry that there may be some sort of, some friction in the third arena, which is the issue of democracy, populism, nationalism, and so sort of, could there be questions asked about what is happening in India? Could there be questions on Kashmir? Certainly, but I would say these questions were asked over the last few years as well. So I don't think it was dependent whether the president is Republican or Democrat for the questions to be asked. The closer you are with a country or with a friend, the more likely the friend will ask you questions. But I don't see that, I don't see any of these questions actually, hurting or damaging the overall partnership, which I believe will get stronger in the coming years.
Great, Dhruva, same question, and let me, specifically talk about that last point that that Aparna mentioned on the democracy and human rights question, because we have a question from one of our attendees, which is, the current government is moving away from a secular democracy. Could this have an adverse effect? Joe Biden, I will say, the Trump White House did not mention human rights issues. The State Department was doing it, so after the Kashmir actions taken by the Indian government, the State Department at the kind of working level made criticisms or raised concerns. You didn't get that from the White House. That is likely to change a little bit with the Joe Biden presidency, especially since he's emphasized that he's going to have a focus on that. He's called for a democracy summit. So, Dhruva, do you think you agree with Aparna that these issues will be more likely to be vocalized, but won't necessarily impact kind of the trajectory of the relationship, or do you think there's something more there?
Right. So, I think the best thing to go by is what Joe Biden and his key advisors have been saying. Tony Blinken, who is going to likely be who's been announced as this nominee for Secretary of State, actually spoke about this at an event at Hudson, in fact, at with Aparna's colleague, Walter Russell Mead. So he spoke about it at some length. Joe Biden actually spoke about the India relationship on August 15th of this year when he gave an address. So, I would agree completely with Aparna's estimate that I think we will see a deepening of the India-US relationship under a Biden administration. Certainly on bilateral relations, on trade, immigration, things like that, I think it will be a much more constructive relationship, or less acrimonious than it sometimes was even under Trump. I think the question really is on the strategic picture, and there I see an improvement. The question is really how much and how fast. And there, the real variable is really what the Biden administration's approach to China is going to be. How much will they look to work with Beijing on certain issues? How much will it be a competitive relationship? And what will flow out as a consequence of that? My understanding is at this point of time, even amongst Biden's advisors, there are different views on this. So I think it'll take a good several months after the incoming administration, and perhaps as much as a year, before we have some idea as to the shape and contours and priority of a broader Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific policy of a Biden administration, and where India fits into that, what kind of priority. One thing to look into is if you look at the priority as an indication of his priorities, who President-elect Biden spoke to on the phone. First, it was allies, European allies and Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the leaders of those countries. But in the second round, India was included amongst that, along with other democratic partners. Finally, on the issue of summit of democracy, I think the question really is, does the fact that India and the US the fact that they're both democracies, is that more of a unifier, or does that lead to more differences? And I still think, even though there are differences, and it's not just about events in the last couple of years in India, but there are, I think, fundamental differences. I recall even under the previous government, differences on freedom of expression, internet freedoms, on sort of checks and balances. So there are different approaches to democracy and liberalism and pluralism in the two countries. But are there more commonalities than differences? And I would still argue that there are in this day and age. So, I would look at the Summit of Democracy as an opportunity for India and the US to deepen the collaboration on an area where that is international democracy, where currently collaboration is still quite limited. So that actually is an opportune area for expanding the partnership.
Excellent. And we'll come back to you with this question as well. So, the realm where the U.S.-India bilateral relationship was strongest over the past 2 decades was security and defense relationships. So, and on the strategic side, now the two countries have signed all four of kind of the main defense agreements that you can. So military to military cooperation is closer today than it has been in the past. So given that that part of the relationship is already so robust, is there a way to kind of, does it mean that the relationship, in order to kind of go to the next level, needs to broaden the scope? Or is there still more it can do on the defense space, strategic space? Two particular areas I want to ask about is, one we've talked about, which is India's technology decoupling. Of course, the United States wants, is competing with China at this point, quite overtly in space. Is there any sort of space for technology cooperation between India and the United States? And second, we had a question from an attendee to Nash Channel where he mentions India's success in in production of solar energy for power. And of course, this is a priority for the Biden administration. So what space is there for greater climate cooperation now under President Biden?
Sorry, is that directed to me, or should I take that first, or?
Yeah, why don't you take part?
Okay, sorry. On that, no, I would agree. I think those are two areas that are emerging as areas of further cooperation. I'll try and address each one separately. Emerging technologies, I think there are a number of areas where the U.S. would seek to compete with China. It requires skills, in terms of, if you look at, most R&D centers today, they're heavily staffed by people of Indian origin and also Chinese origin. So I think it'll lead to some questions of, it'll be closely tied to immigration policy and amongst other things. But I'll give you an example. Artificial intelligence. There's a bipartisan congressional committee that is focused on national security and artificial intelligence. And they have already released their interim report. Their final report is coming out in March of next year for the new administration, a little bit after the new administration comes in. But a key recommendation of theirs is deepening the partnership with India. And in fact, outside of Europe, it's actually a sort of a high priority for the Commission is to deepen the relationship with India. So if this starts to inform legislation, which is what it's meant to do, and by extension U.S. policy, I think we will see at least an opportunity for India and the U.S. to work much more closely on AI going forward, which will have both military and commercial applications. Well, so I think that's sort of one example of emerging technology cooperation where there is a sort of bipartisan consensus on deepening the relationship with India. On climate change, I think we've seen India put together a very ambitious program for renewables, particularly solar and wind, at least bringing on generation capacity very quickly. The idea is to actually stay in line with India's Paris climate commitments, which are relatively modest, actually, but still in line with a sort of 2-degree threshold. The question I think for a Biden administration is, are they able to do something, renegotiate something more ambitious, which I think is very unlikely, just given the amount of political capital that went into the Paris Climate Agreement and the U.S. withdrawal from that. So, first step will be the U.S. entering back into that. Whether they decide to then push for something sort of higher standards, I think will open up a different thing. And India will actually not even be the biggest issue there. It'll be other countries. But I think barring that, I think India can make a very strong and persuasive case that it is abiding by its own Paris commitments, and the U.S. needs to come on board. And then the question really is, can we accelerate that? Can you deepen the technological partnership when it comes to climate change?
Great, and we're starting to run out of time, so I actually would like to move to China. So, Aparna, in your book, you write that a geopolitical rivalry between China and India is inevitable. And India, for the last 2 decades or so, has been hesitant about leaning towards the United States, but really has come as close as it has in the past in the last couple of years. And when we had the historic Galwan Valley confrontation, where for the first time in 45 years, I believe, 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives. We know Chinese troops also lost their lives. We don't have the number. There was a lot of commentary at that point saying if this is an inflection point, this means that India and China are now going to be rivals. It is now a given. This is going to make the United States and India be much, much closer together, be strategic partners like they've never been before. So my question is, do you think that jump from A to B, that US and India are now going to be immediately, automatically much closer and balanced, partnered together to balance China, do you think that's a given, or do you think we're still a ways away from that?
So I would say that India and US are closer. There's more of an alignment. I wouldn't say there's an alliance or any potential alliance. But what I would say the critical factor here or country is China. The more China pushes India, the more India is likely to move closer to the United States and the other allies. The more, if China backs off, and China actually tries to find a via media on the border or other issues, then India is more likely to continue its current policy. The question will be, how does China act? Because, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, for India, China is a country which actually covets Indian territory. It is seeking to take over India's sphere of influence. So it is more of an existential threat than any other threat, but it will all depend on what China does, because India is at the end of the day a status quo power. India is not interested in taking over territory. India is interested in defending territory, but not taking over territory. So what China does will frame what India's policies will be. But yes, the India-US alignment will continue. How much closer the two countries get will depend partly on will depend a lot on China, is how I would look at it.
Dhruva, let me turn to you on a related question. So, the border standoffs we've seen, there's been media reporting that ultimately India lost some territory. Neither side has really said anything about, we don't really know a lot of information about, on the Chinese side, we don't even know how many troops were lost. And so my question is, despite the series of talks at the military level, at the diplomatic level, there's been no resolution on the border issue, not even kind of on short-term issues, it seems. And so we're going into a winter now where you have both sides increasing their deployments. You have much more capability on both sides of the border. Tensions remain high. So, looking into 2021, do you see, the possibility for another confrontation like we saw in Galwan happening in the coming year or so? And really, what are India's options in this case, given that generally speaking, China has a conventional superiority, not just in general, but at the border specifically too, it seems. What are India's options? And are we basically going to be seeing the same picture? We have the standstill, intense kind of standoff on the border for months to come.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we've seen, we've seen both sides sort of beefing up their presence on the border, on the dispute boundary. Particularly, I mean, this is so far largely relegated to one sector, the Western sector. The India-China boundary dispute spans sort of three broad areas and several thousand kilometers. This is a particularly undemarcated area. There never was a sort of mutually agreed map as to where the boundary lay. But we have seen China changing the status quo in this year, using military force. I think so far, if the status quo remains, and we're into December, it looks like both sides are sort of settling in with a forward presence throughout the winter. Indian troops do have some experience with this, because this is in fact the normal in sections of the boundary with Pakistan, particularly the Siachen Glacier, which is not very far away from eastern Ladakh. So I think again, if barring some unforeseen development, we will see Indian and Chinese troops staying out there through the winter. Again, Chinese facilities and infrastructure are better on their side of the boundary, but the Indian forces do have some experience in staying in high altitudes for long periods of time, even throughout a winter. This is, I think, what stays. But the bigger picture, I think, has changed fundamentally. And I completely agree with Aparna here, which is, if you look at the India-China relationship, this is something that traditionally was characterized by a boundary dispute, by regional security differences, particularly in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, by an economic and trade relationship, which was once more cooperative, but is now seen in increasingly adversarial terms. And also a sort of a global governance component and institutional cooperation, where a decade ago, India and China were cooperating a lot on multilateral institutions, but today, for a variety of reasons, we're seeing less of that cooperation. Some of it having to do with substantive disagreements, some of it having to do with institutional membership. So on every aspect of India-China relations today, we're seeing a much more competitive atmosphere. Again, 10 years ago, we could have made the case that, well, the economic and trade relationship and multilateral issues will bridge some of the divides. Today, there is, it's harder and harder to make that case. So I think I would look at the boundary difference, which will persist and has been exacerbated, as part of a larger evolution of a much more competitive India-China relationship, at least for the foreseeable future. And in fact, I would say on almost every aspect today of Indian foreign policy, whether it's the neighborhood, whether it's Pakistan, whether it is relations with Russia, whether it's relations with Europe or the Indo-Pacific, China looms large today, and not in a positive way.
Well, we're running out of time. We're out of time, but I'd like to end on a positive note. We talked about glass half full, glass half empty. We've discussed how the India-China relationship really is, at a very tense moment. We see the kind of economic and public health crisis the government's dealing with. But both of you pay very close attention to what's happening in the country. So I'd like to challenge you to tell us, a positive development, a story, whether it's a policy change, a story you've heard, something you've seen in India that gives you some hope, gives you some sense that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and that we'll soon get out of all of this. So why don't I start with Aparna? And sorry for putting you on the spot.
No, not at all. I guess, sort of the one story which has stayed with me when I read about it was about, sort of the fact that today education is very difficult, right? Because schools are closed and so many students have to learn from home. But it's the poor kids who are sort of, or the unprivileged ones which suffer the most. So there was a story in which this sort of a father, a blue-collar worker in India, he couldn't really afford to purchase a laptop or so for his children. So he actually sells something in order to buy a phone, so that each of his daughters could actually sort of, follow school. And so when the story went viral, people actually provided sort of, gave money so that they could get a laptop and they could have for each of those kids. I think it's stories like that, the human connection, this a small, like a dhaba hawker, sort of husband and wife, very elderly, they're selling food, nobody's coming to buy them. Buy food products from them, and somebody takes a video and posts it on Twitter, and the next day they have about 5,000 people standing outside their shop and willing to purchase from them. That, I think, is the part which tells me that, at the end of the day, humans do care about the others, and when they're given the opportunity, they will go out and do something to help them.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Dhruva.
Well, I think I'm just much more optimistic, and I don't see a sort of doom and gloom. And again, I think we have to be realistic about some challenges that India continues to face, and I think overcoming some of those challenges will be very difficult, if not impossible. But I don't think there is this sense of doom and gloom. And I spent, before moving back to Washington last year, I spent the previous 3.5 years in India, working in India and Delhi at Brookings India. And in that time, I visited maybe 20 odd states and union territories, small towns, and from Ladakh to the Andaman Islands, from Kerala to Calcutta to Gujarat, everywhere. And I think India is a really young country. I'm 37, and 2/3 of India is younger than me. And this is again, no matter what the demographic, these are Indians who have grown up in a very different world, in a post-1991 liberalization, post-Cold War world. And they're ambitious, again, at different levels, but they're impatient, they're ambitious, they think they can achieve things. They are not waiting for people to sort of, to come to their help. They want, and I think one of the things that's a disservice to them is they sometimes just not had the opportunity, and I think it's about giving them that opportunity to succeed in whatever they do. But that hunger, that drive is there, and it's hard to, I think numbers don't do justice to it. Metrics, it's palpable, right? And it's less in, my experience, it's less in the big cities, in the big metro areas. The big change is really in the second tier cities, places like, Chandigarh and Visakhapatnam and places like that, which have transformed, Coimbatore. These places have transformed dramatically over the last 20 years. I see no reason why they will not continue to change. But if I want to just find on two positive notes, two things that if you were to look back over the last 25 years in India, two things that are visible signs of change. One is, I would say, metro rail transit. This was something, when I was growing up in India, nobody thought this was going to be possible because it was unsafe. It would be, it would be dirty. It would be, you couldn't have mass transit in a country like India. And yet this is now a feature of a lot of urban landscapes. The second big change has been the mobile revolution, and how that has, affected things like literacy, things like trade, how small shopkeepers deal with their clients. So these are things that sort of touch average Indians in a way. And I think, when we talk about policy at the high levels, we sometimes lose track of these very real, tangible changes that are taking place on a day-to-day basis. So, all of this is a way of saying I'm quite optimistic about India's future. I think we're at a point where there's a big bump in the road, but the road only goes up.
That's excellent, and we should keep in mind, India next year could very much be one of the bright spots in the fact that it's leading on vaccine creation, and so it will be in some ways part of the answer to the global problem we're all facing. Dhruva, Aparna, thank you very much for a very illuminating conversation. I apologize to our attendees for going a few minutes over time, but thank you very much, and I'll hand it over back to Anjali to say farewell.
Thank you, Anubhav. That was a really wonderful conversation. And Dhruva, Aparna, I really appreciate you guys spending the time with us tonight. And to ASPI for partnering with us on this program. This is likely the last program we'll be hosting in 2021, but hopeful that we can again work with ASPI and do more India-related programs in the coming year. And I'd just like to wrap up with one final appeal on this Giving Tuesday. If you enjoyed tonight's program or the 24 or so other programs we've hosted for free during the pandemic, we'd appreciate if you would consider joining as a member or giving us a donation. I'll share the websites right now on your screen. Anything would be greatly appreciated. So until we meet again, thank you very much and good night.